Welcome back to Combat Mission Red Thunder, where we're going to take a look at Soviet Tankodesantniki, henceforth referred to as tank descent troops, so I don't have to mangle the pronunciation again. These are infantry formations specifically designated as tank riders. So what we're going to do is take a look at the concept of infantry riding on tanks, how tank descent companies in Combat Mission Red Thunder are organised and equipped, and how to use them on the battlefield. Naturally, as long as the game allows it, any infantry can hop on a tank and function the same way, so this is going to be somewhat relevant to all of the games that allow tank riders. Currently that's Red Thunder and Final Blitzkrieg. The idea of tank descent troops is very simple. Tanks have firepower and mobility. Infantry have situational awareness and the ability to infest and clear out dense terrain. Acting in concert, they benefit from each other's strengths and mitigate each other's differences. The problem is, tanks are fast, and infantry are not. Providing the infantry with their own vehicles is expensive, creates a significant logistical backend, and generates some difficult tactical questions about where infantry vehicles should sit on the sliding scale between battle taxi and infantry fighting vehicle. So why go through all the trouble of engaging with that problem when tanks are already in the mix? Just stick the infantry on the tanks, maybe weld some rails on the side so they can hang on for dear life. Problem solved for essentially zero cost and effort. Tank infantry corporation and combined arms, here we come. It is obviously slightly more complicated in practice than in concept. Armour infantry cooperation does not magically happen when tanks and infantry are stuck together on the battlefield. For one, the tanks are a physical danger to the infantry. Nobody wants to get crushed under the tracks, burnt on engine exhausts, or mangled by a rotating turret. The infantry needs to understand and be able to act on the threats to the tanks, such as enemy anti-tank teams, anti-tank guns, and certain types or features of terrain so that they can deal with them. The tanks reciprocally need to understand the threats to the infantry and deal with them. Tanks and infantry need to be able to communicate with one another. Not an easy task in World War II when tanks are mostly blind, infantry need to stay hidden on the battlefield to survive, and neither have radios that talk to each other. So it makes sense to have specific units or subunits trained in armour infantry coordination, or by organising armour and infantry into the same formations so that they gain experience working with one another. This is what the Soviet Union does in World War II. As such, there aren't any pure tank descent formations in Combat Mission Red Thunder. They're always a component of larger organisations and they aren't available separately. There are two types with almost inconsequential differences. An infantry type, found in company strength in the Motorised Submachine Gun Battalion, and included in the 44 type Motorised Rifle Battalion at platoon strength. Then there is an armour type of tank descent troops in company strength found in the 43 type tank regiment. These troops are armed with two types of weapon. In the 43 type organisation there is one man per platoon armed with a scoped Mosin Nagant, which I'm not even going to bother to talk about because everybody else is armed with a submachine gun. This is either a PPS-H41, which comes with the famous 71 round drum magazine and empties that at 900 rounds a minute, or a PPS-43, which comes with 35 round stick magazines and fires them off at the comparatively sedate 600 rounds per minute. The Soviets are the only belligerent in World War II to really issue submachine guns en masse, and have units like tank descent troops who are universally equipped with them. And it's not difficult to understand why. Submachine guns are relatively easy to manufacture. They are also easier to use effectively on the battlefield than bolt-action rifles. Something like a Mosin Nagant might be longer ranged and more accurate than a PPSH, but as ever, actually spotting targets at range is difficult, and this smaller submachine gun cartridge makes recoil more manageable. In game, both SMGs have a maximum range of 200 meters, and this close range and the quantities of fire going out give the shooter rapid feedback on where their rounds are going, so they can correct on target quite easily. Speaking of the cartridge, this is the 7.62x25 pistol round, which, like the SMGs, requires fewer materials and is quicker and easier to make than its rifle counterpart. Every squad has upwards of 1,500 rounds. There are 3 SMG armed squads in each tank descent platoon, led by a platoon HQ. In the 43 type tank regiment, each squad is 7 men strong, and the platoon HQ is a separate 2-man team, with the platoon leader and a very confused Mosin-Nagant equipped marksman. In the infantry organisation, the platoon leader heads up the first squad of the platoon as the 11th man. There is no separate HQ unit. Leaders have binoculars and every man carries 2 hand grenades, but they have no other equipment. There are 3 platoons in each company, led by a company HQ. The armour type has 2 men, the infantry type has 3 men, and obviously they all have submachine guns. So tank descent units are very simple and have, for World War II, a very high amount of short-range firepower. They don't have the organic heavy weapons that other formations typically have at company level. They don't even have LMGs or massed rifles to generate longer range firepower. But when you consider that they're supposed to be working in close coordination with tanks, that's not a problem. Importantly, the triangular company organisation, 3 platoons of 3 squads, matches up to the Soviet tank formations, which are set up with 3 platoons of 3 tanks per company. So a company of tank descent troops can pair up to a company of tanks with 1 squad per tank and 1 platoon per tank platoon. Simple. What's less simple is how to get the best out of tank descent troops on the battlefield. The key tactical question is, as always with any kind of mounted infantry, when to dismount. At one end of the scale we have don't dismount at all. Tank descent troops are entirely capable of firing their weapons whilst mounted. They can provide their tank close in protection against anti-tank teams like pop-up Panzerfausts without compromising any speed. The issue with this is that tank riding under direct fire is incredibly dangerous. Infantry mounted on tanks only have protection if the turret is in between them and the enemy, and even then they're still pretty exposed. Infantry generally rely on 2 critical measures to stay alive on the battlefield: hiding and spreading out. Sitting on a tank compromises both of these. A tank is a big, loud, moving focus of attention, and a squad sitting on the back of one is about as pumped up as they're ever going to get unless they dogpile each other. Not only are infantry mounted on tanks highly vulnerable to simple small arms fire, tanks themselves are also the obvious target for anti-tank weapons. Non-penetrating hits and the shrapnel they create will make a mess of infantry. If the tank explodes or sets on fire, as tanks tend to do when penetrated, any fragile squishy humans sitting on top of it are going to have a bad day. Hand in hand with this, any survivors who pile off a tank that suffers a hit or come under fire have not only lost the mobility offered by the vehicle, but are probably going to be pinned down or panicking in the middle of a kill zone. This is not to say that riding directly up to enemy positions and conducting PPSH drive-bys is not going to work. The third battlefield survival measure is suppression. If the enemy can be convinced to keep their heads down by fires, whether direct or indirect, organic or supporting, then tank descent troops can be relatively safe. And because they can exploit the mobility they gain by riding a tank into battle, they can cross danger areas much faster than dismounted infantry, meaning that the enemy needs to be suppressed for a much shorter period of time. So while tank riding can put the death in death before dismount, it can be an effective measure in the right conditions. At the other end of the when to dismount scale, we have dismount at the first opportunity. This would seem to be somewhat defying the point of tank descent troops in the first place, but especially in a combat mission context, we're thinking about forces that have already arrived at the battlefield. Beyond the tactical, thinking about the operational, mounting infantry on tanks makes a lot of sense, especially in the kind of breakthrough and exploitation operations cherished by Soviet doctrine. Once there's a hole in the enemy lines and the armoured reserve pours through to penetrate into the enemy's depth, tank descent troops can really shine because they allow the tank units to easily take infantry with them. All the tactical options of tank-infantry cooperation flow from the fact that the infantry actually arrived with the tanks. So in a sense, if there are tank descent troops on the field at the start of the battle, they may have done the important part. However, Not only is defining the start of a battle a tricky business outside the artificial environment of a wargame, but there's not much point dismounting a kilometre away from the enemy if you can get closer without risk. If the terrain and tactical conditions allow tank descent troops to ride their tanks into close proximity of the enemy before dismounting to fight, then the speed and pace of an attack or counterattack can vastly increase. Depositing infantry a terrain feature away from the enemy allows them to benefit from the mobility of the tanks without subjecting themselves to the risk of riding into direct fire. Naturally, this places a premium on effective reconnaissance. Locating enemy positions by accidentally stumbling into an ambush with mounted tank descent troops is a recipe for disaster. Dismounting too early, for the sake of caution, may use up valuable time that the enemy can exploit. As ever, the trick is finding the right place on the sliding scale between never dismount and dismount immediately to suit the tactical conditions. How to operate tank descent troops once they're dismounted depends a lot on what you're trying to achieve. On the infantry tank cooperation front, obviously a key role is to move forward and root out threats to the tank, whether that is overrunning anti-tank guns, clearing areas of potential anti-tank ambushes, or simply scouting ahead. In the attack, a mob of angry submachine gunners can be a big problem for the enemy, especially in dense terrain. They are probably the best troops for clearing the enemy out of trenches and buildings, especially with tanks on hand to blow away any particularly tough enemy positions. But for the same reasons, they're also solid defensive troops. Being able to rapidly seize a terrain feature the enemy can't afford to ignore and immediately infest it with tank descent troops leaves the enemy in a difficult place, especially if done quickly. One issue to look out for, though, is ammunition supply. Submachine guns with high rates of fire are going to burn through their ammunition very quickly, so making sure that engagements are limited, preferably as fast and decisive as possible, or making sure that there are other elements following them up with extra ammunition is vital. As ever with the Soviets, a good policy to follow is to think a level up. If you have a job for a squad, send a platoon. If you have a job for a platoon, send a company. This is not only about concentrating force at the decisive point, but about simplifying command and control. Tank descent troops may be able to gain some benefit from the radios of tanks they ride on, but they don't have their own, and once dismounted they're relying on bad language and rude gestures to communicate. These are much less effective means at range than radios, so keeping whole companies focused in space and time on the same task without indulging in more complex maneuvers helps to offset their C2 shortfalls. So, that's a quick overview of Soviet tank descent troops in Combat Mission Red Thunder. It's a very simple but powerful formation if used effectively, and that effective use is essentially an exercise in dismounting at the right time. Not too early and not too late. Understanding what goes into making that decision is going to be useful in all the combat mission games, not just Red Thunder. Hope you all enjoyed this and found it useful. I'll catch you in the next video.